Okay, we got another chapter. And as someone who's waited 5 months between chapter 251 and 252, getting 253 like 3 days after is great, amazing. And sorry, it might have been 5 days, but even still, I hope that we actually get another chapter soon because this chapter is named as a part one. It is, if it is indeed fated, we'll meet again someday. And it's the first of two chapters. So before we get into this review, I kind of skipped something really important because it was mentioned in the previous chapter, but I kind of didn't note of it because it was something that was mentioned a while back, the Helix Energy, because Apocryphos says that he'll use the innocence and absorb all of Allen's Helix Energy to make him not exist anymore. And essentially, for all of these purposes, I didn't catch that, but back in chapter 221, if any of you want to reread that after this, when Nea, who is currently in control of Allen's body at that point, is kind of confronted by Mana as well as two people from the Order. One of the people from the Order gets kind of their soul absorbed by Mana, and we learn in this moment that Bookman Jr., which this is kind of like his first like real appearance, in my opinion, is explained to Nea, who didn't know how this worked. So this is another interesting thing, and we'll see it again in this chapter, how Bookman Jr. or Lavi knows a lot more about the Helix Energy than Apocryphos and most of the Noahs. But it's essentially explained that a body is only the vessel for the soul, and the soul is part of the helix of energy that kind of derives all things in the universe. And without like the body as its vessel, it essentially becomes part of the natural world. So as we learned in this chapter and as we saw in that one, both sides, be that the Noahs, the Earl, the Akumas versus like the Innocents, both use this energy, and it's within every single person. And it's kind of the cause for evolution as well as bringing about a life's potential. So it is also their greatest power. And that's really what is focused on within that chapter, and emphasizing that the Earl is one who eats or devours those souls or that helix energy. So with all of that said, back to the current chapter, that is seemingly what Apocryphos is doing here to try to absorb or use Allen's helix energy to power innocence. So what we see with all of this is that, and I'm kind of skipping ahead a little, but we see that innocence is essentially using their accommodators or the exorcists to give this helix energy to the heart and strengthen it. But I'll get there in a second. So where we left off in the previous chapter is kind of had a cliffhanger, was that Lavi jumped in to kind of take some of the burden away from Allen as the helix energy was being stripped from him by the shard of innocence that Apocryphos was using. And it is confirmed in this chapter that that is a separate shard of innocence and not the one that, and not like any of his abilities himself, which makes sense, kind of a given there because we see it form the shape of Allen's arm, and I don't believe that Allen's arm was a shard of innocence, which was Apocryphos. So, anyways, Lavi's like, our journey will continue to go on, and don't feel bad about this, Allen. Where then we're kind of cut off because Apocryphos is like, what are you doing, Bookman Jr.? It doesn't matter. Two souls won't be able to overpower this innocence and the great helix energy within it. So it's like, you're doing a meaningless action. You don't need to do this. And I don't know if Apocryphos himself has like a code with the Bookman, as we saw with Bookman and Lavi being captured. They do have somewhat of a code, or at least a pact or a truce with the Bookman. They're like, we'll let you do what you're planning to do. So maybe that's a case where he's like, I respect the Bookman. Don't do this. You're not going to survive. But anyways, it kind of continues from there, and we actually see here that Bookman Jr. or Lavi is like, actually, I know a lot more about Helix Energy than you do. And that makes sense because, like I said, in chapter 221, he is the one who actually explained to Nea what Helix Energy is. And the key thing here is that it is like hope, struggle, love, and hatred. This is repeated a second time. It's essentially through the bonds that someone makes in their lives, the Helix Energy within them becomes stronger and ultimately is kind of the core of what Helix Energy is. As a life touches another life, the connections that people have between each other, it gets strengthened. And in the next page, it's a beautiful kind of picture of all the people who have played a role in Lavi's life, obviously showing Allen, Nea, and Bookman. We also get confirmed that Bookman is actually this Lavi's dad, which isn't the case with the other Lavi, as we find out in this chapter, but also was pretty hinted at as well. I never assumed that Bookman was his dad. I just assumed they were connected by fate. I assume Lavi followed the criteria, had enough, the current Lavi, to clarify, had enough like context and understanding and mental capacity to become the next Bookman. We find out here it's more of like a Gojo with the 6 eyes. There can only be one Bookman and one Bookman Jr. in the world at a given time. So when Bookman Jr. ultimately passes away in this chapter, Lavi is born, or other Lavi. So as this continues, this is another awesome panel. Like, the art in this chapter is great, where Lavi yells, like, "Don't underestimate me." And then we finally get sent into kind of this mental space where both Lavi's soul and Allen's soul are together as they are fighting the innocents. We see like shards of Allen fading away, with pretty much leaving a little bit of his chest, his now head, which is of a younger body, and the arm of innocence that will ultimately become his future arm. And Lavi shows up in there, and he's like, "Are we dead?" And Lavi's like, "Not yet, but we will be." So he's going to sacrifice himself and become part of Allen's soul in order to kind of save Allen. Well, Allen's kind of opposed to this because he doesn't want Lavi to sacrifice himself. And we also get a greater explanation of Helix Energy here, which apparently he just explains to everybody, which I love. That the fact that like he's just like this expert on Helix Energy, and he's like, "I've explained it to you, Allen, multiple times. I've explained it to Nea. I've just kind of explained it partially to Apocryphos." Probably is just like, "Hey, do you want to know about Helix Energy?" to anybody on the street. But essentially the key with this is that Innocence kind of feeds off of this Helix Energy to use. And the way that it works, and this is like really weirdly translated to English. There might be a better translation in the coming days, but it seems as though, I'm going to read it verbatim here just for that reason. It's like, "By the chance meeting of good and bad fortune, of weal and woe, the Helix Energy of humans unleash strong energy." And Innocence selects accommodators, those humans who are particularly cruelly toyed with by fate, and possess them. And thus, I'm sorry, I'm reading so badly, and thus they have fed on the helix of their accommodators, turn them into offerings for the heart. So essentially, how I sum that up, is essentially the more like tough life you have, the harder or the stronger your Helix Energy becomes. And as you are chosen as an accommodator or an exorcist within the world by a shard of innocence, the innocence is slowly like feeding upon your Helix Energy in exchange for you kind of being able to use its power, and also have to live by its rules, or else you become a fallen one, so that it can offer your Helix Energy to the heart to strengthen it. We also see the heart in this picture, which is literally a heart. We don't know if that's the actual heart of Innocence, but you can actually see that it's a little bit corroded and not in the best shape, which is why Lavi says that we actually have a chance to survive, or correct, I guess Allen has a chance to survive here. So Lavi is kind of letting himself help rebuild Allen's body through like giving him his Helix Energy. And by combining their two Helix Energies together as two people who have massive amounts of misfortune and strong connections, especially between each other, they'll create a great amount of Helix energy that will ultimately save Allen, because the heart's body is still incomplete. So it won't be able to take all the power that we're accumulating together, thus, you'll be safe. That is essentially Lavi's plan. And the key thing here in this page is it says that the heart's body is incomplete. So does this potentially mean that the heart is similar to Apocryphos? It's its own innocence. So much throughout this story, when Lena Lee turns into a crystal for a little bit, or gets crystal type innocence, there's a lot of speculation that she becomes the heart, or she was the heart. And then when Allen was saved by his innocence, we also believed he could be the heart. But this could either mean that the heart is always the accommodator is the same, and whenever they get injured, they kind of go into hiding. Apocryphos does the dirty work for the heart, and spreads out all the innocence to make sure that everybody gives their Helix energy to the heart, and the heart is healed. Now, this is well in the past at this point. In this chapter alone, we skip 8 years at least. So from that alone, you could argue the heart is now fully active, so that we can have the heart in the main part of the story, because he'll be young again. So maybe Allen's at this point 7, 8. Then you throw on another 8-ish years, but I think Allen's 15, 16. So I'd say the heart is fully powered back up by this point. But I am curious what damaged the heart, and if it's literally the heart of innocence itself got damaged, or if potentially the heart of innocence is always linked with a specific accommodator, similar to maybe how these bookmen are, where you have to be chosen to be a bookman by fate. So anyways, it's essentially that because we're doing this, Lavi mentions that Allen will face far more suffering than he had in the past. And we don't exactly know why. We definitely know Allen has dealt with a lot of suffering in his own right. He ended up being cursed with the eye that can see Akuma, and is ultimately always seeing suffering. But Lavi's just live on, despite all the suffering you're going to do. It's been fun traveling with you, but ultimately, my time is up. And I appreciate all the you letting me tell you my stories. And Lavi's begging him not to, because we get a little bit more context on Lavi right here, where Bookman is officially canonically his dad, I'm assuming, or it could be biological, it could not be. Maybe he was chosen from a young age and it's just a dad thing. But we also get to see young Bookman here, and he wanted to talk to Bookman, potentially explaining why he left. We don't get the context of what he wanted to talk about here, but it is shown that he did want to talk with Bookman. So on that note, it's just really interesting to see what this conversation could have been, or if Bookman maybe knows what the conversation would have been, as they just never met again. But like the Zoogle said, realistically, the Bookmen have no clue where or what happened to Lavi, or Lavi passed, or Bookman Jr. So anyways, it kind of is left there, where he's please live, but ultimately he's it's fine, because when I die, the next Bookman Jr. will be born into this world. Like I said, Gojo and the Six Eyes, there can only be one Bookman Jr. and one Bookman in the world. Or if you want to think Star Wars wise, it's the Master and the Apprentice. Any other Sith are kind of erased. So essentially, he also calls himself a child of calamity, and says that the future Lavi is actually the true heir, because maybe it's, and I kind of take this as him not wanting to follow the traditional path of a Bookman. It could mean something else, where this Lavi knows something, or something special, where he doesn't think he's worthy of being a Bookman, and that could be potentially what he wanted to talk with Bookman about before his death. But we never know. So he's they'll take over for me, Allen. It's fine. Don't worry about me. You're the important one to survive. And Allen is kind of now left alone in this kind of void space. And he's now fighting back. He's Lavi's gone now. I'm not going to let his sacrifice be in vain. he seemingly shoots out a bunch of Helix energy at this innocence to prevent it from swallowing him. And Apocryphos sees this light, and he's caught off guard. Naturally, he was caught off guard when Lavi originally created this spear that is still going throughout the chapter, but we see like extra light coming from the spear now. And Apocryphos is kind of confused on what's happening. It's really like, what is going on? Two humans cannot overpower innocence. I've never seen anything like this before. And he can't even like get the innocence to respond back to him. It could be the innocence might be broken off its connection from the heart from all this Helix energy, because like Lavi said, the heart can't take it all. So maybe this innocence acted on its own to ensure that Allen doesn't become dangerous to the heart of innocence, and hence it's created this spear around him and protecting Apocryphos and everything else. And maybe this is why Allen's innocence is so unique compared to all the other ones. It saved his life. You could argue this could be a lot of the Apocryphos stuff that we don't know. Like Apocryphos saves Allen after the Allen backstory where he's like, you're going to suffer a lot more for the heart's sake. But anyways, Apocryphos is like, what is going on? I can't even sense either Allen or Bookman Jr. right now. Are they dead? If they are, why isn't the innocence coming back to me? He's just like, I've never experienced anything like this before. It's just continuously going there. And he just doesn't know why. He is so confused, and he just kind of continuously stands there. He's just like, I've never experienced this before. And ultimately, he stays there. And it seems like he just stands there for over a year, because it's either that he keeps checking back whenever we see this, or something else occurs. So anyways, we cut away at this point to deal with the remainder of Lavi's birth now. So Apocryphos is standing, and a year and a half has passed. We see like a small village where there seems to be people connected to Bookman, because when Lavi is born, they instantly know to contact Bookman. They see Lavi, and there's something, I guess, unique about Lavi. We don't really get to see what that is, at least from my perspective, looking through the chapter. But they're able to instantly tell he is the next Bookman Jr. So they contact Bookman, and that's kind of where that storyline ends up. And this is why we know they ultimately meet up, and then Lavi becomes the Bookman Jr. that we know in the current story. And this also, because we learned here that it's the similar, only one can exist at a given time, it also explains why the threat for Bookman is so real when he's captured by the Noah when they went to learn about Nea. Because if Lavi does get killed by the Noah, it's not like he can just pick someone else and start their training. He has to literally let them age up. And now that he's already so much older than he was just with Bookman Jr. at this point, which was, this could be 35 years ago. It's really tough to tell exactly how long ago it was, given that some of this time frame is working and that Lavi and Bookman at this point have already been, Lavi and Allen have been together for a certain amount of time. You could argue it's a few years past the 35 years ago mark, and then we get more time skips here to balance this out. Maybe they were together for like 5 years, just balancing out timelines to some extent. Could be 18 years ago. I honestly just don't know for sure. Anyways, after this, we cut back to Apocryphos, and he's just still standing there. Like I said, he hasn't really moved. He's just seeing this innocence and stalemate, and he starts thinking about what the origin, what the meaning of Helix Energy is based on the 4 words that Lavi explained, which were hope, struggle, love, and hatred. Those were the things that power the Helix Energy. And Apocryphos wants to see it. Maybe he thinks it's something unique, or probably he's like, maybe this will allow me to harness this energy more. So he just keeps staring up at the spear. We see this cool, like, overshadowed picture of both old Allen and Bookman Jr. just hovering over it, obviously, like, in silhouette, or like not really in the picture actually, but like meant to show them. And then we get another time skip. 7 more years pass. And the question is, does Apocryphos stay there the whole time? So essentially, that is where the chapter ends. And as it's a part 1, I don't exactly know where we will end up with this. But for what we do know, it does set up a lot of interesting stuff. So we now know that, like, Allen and Bookman are one. Bookman Jr.'s soul is a part of Allen's body. I don't know if that will mean that we'll ever get to see him again, or maybe there could be a cool moment between Allen and Bookman so that Allen can say whatever Bookman Jr. wanted to say to Bookman. But it is interesting how that will play out. Also, it's interesting now to see, does Allen's innocence actually act differently because of this experience, and is it even still connected to the heart the same way? Because Allen and Bookman Jr. have so much Helix energy, and potentially that could harness it. Like, the way that heart always seems to work in the story is if the heart is ever destroyed, all innocence loses its power. That's why all the exorcists have to protect it, so that they can use the innocence to stop the Akuma, the Noah, and the Earl. But if Allen's innocence kind of can work as a pseudo-heart, there might be a world where all the remaining exorcists can still activate their abilities, but also just no longer be under the thumb of the heart and have, like, the fallen one curse, like, hovering above them. So I will be really interested to see where this story goes from here and how this part 2 ends, and whether Apocryphos is still there 7 years later. I also just really like to imagine, like, Apocryphos standing over this, like, spear, and then a bunch of people just walk by. Because, like, you have to imagine people walk by within 7 years. It's now 8.5 technically. So, and he's just like, leave, or he just kills all these people who show up because he's waiting to kind of learn more and potentially harness the potential of this Helix energy. Anyways, there's a lot to unpack here, and I think Helix Energy in its own right deserves a video, and I'm sorry I didn't mention it in the previous chapter. There's just so much going on, and, like, it was last mentioned in 2019. It's nearly the end of 2024 now. It's hard to keep everything straight with D.Gray Man, but it was mentioned before. So I'd recommend rereading chapter 221 for anybody if you stayed this long, if you want to learn more about Helix Energy, or stick around for whenever I do make that video on it. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm sorry for all my mumbling and stumbling that I made throughout this. It's just like I tried to get through this really fast and try to get it up as fast as possible for you guys. Not the greatest editor. So if you like the content and want to see more of my D.Gray Man videos, I only really, so far, channel reviews and, chapter reviews, see more mumbling and stumbling, as well as one video on Third Exorcist to kind of explain what they are. I plan to do more videos like that, explaining more concepts and ideas within the D.Gray Man world while we wait between chapters. So if you guys want to see that, please let me know in the comment section. If you have different ideas on this that you'd want me to discuss, I'd be happy to do that too, assuming I'm also interested, or it's a really good question, whatever. So if you like my content, please like, comment, and subscribe, and thank you for sticking around.